Hey, this week I sit down with Amos Shelley of Chasing.Lion. Now, you might not have heard that name yet, but believe me when I tell you, if you stick around, you're going to be glad that you did, because Amos talks all about how to become a better, more compelling, more impactful storyteller. And we talk about this from a church perspective, but you can apply the things that he's going to talk about today in any setting and really begin to inspire the people around you. So if you've ever wanted to become a better storyteller, but you weren't quite sure how, then you need to stick around, because we're getting started right now. Hey there, my name is Mike Waslick. I'm a church helper, and my goal today is to help your church make every decision on purpose. Now, today on the podcast, I am so thrilled to introduce you to Amos Shelley. Amos Shelley is the founder of Chasing.Lion. He's been a family ministry pastor and a teacher for a really, really long time, and he is an incredible storyteller. And what he's going to talk about is his journey through discovering the importance of story and how to structure one. He's going to give you some do's and don'ts on how to tell a great story, including making sure that you leave things open-ended and you leave room for imagination. And then he's going to tell you about a few of the projects that he's got on the go, including Story in a Box and the Friendly Neighborhood Pocket Book. Now, I can't wait for you to hear this episode, so I am going to cut this intro way short, and we're going to get into it right now. Here we go. Amos, thanks so much for joining me today. Really appreciate you being here.
My pleasure. It's great to be here.
So I've done a little bit of an intro, but tell people a little bit about yourself, sort of how you got started, where you've been working, and what you're up to now.
Oh, those are great questions. Where to get started? Well, way back 1984, it was a golden October morning when I was birthed into this world. And
right.
Yeah, did you want to go that far back? Probably not.
I think we could.
So,
we can
pertinent
fast
to
forward a little bit.
this conversation, it actually goes back probably to my Bible college days.
Okay.
I didn't have a job, and
Right.
I was very much in love with this girl, and I wanted to buy a ring, and I needed a job. And my small group leader hinted, or actually offered, that they needed a van driver for an after school care program, kind of associated with one of the churches that I actually attended. And I applied, and I got the job. And I actually shouldn't have gotten the job, because I couldn't actually get a BC driver's license. So I actually never ever once drove the bus.
That's amazing.
For several years, and it kind of got me working in with children. Before that, I had no experience. I'm from a big family. I had no experience working with kids, no experience working with children in kind of a ministry setting. And it kind of was the foray into my life, working with kids and families and generations in kind of a ministry context, in a kind of a church setting. And I did save enough money. I bought a ring and got engaged that winter, married that summer, and my wife, been married 16 years, something like that. We worked together for several years at the same out of school care.
Right.
So that was kind of the jump into working with kids. And then when I kind of graduated from Bible college and was looking to do my master's, I got offered another job as a children's pastor part-time, which I had never considered doing. So my whole kind of career working with kids kind of started accidentally. It wasn't purposeful.
Now, when you got hired as the children's pastor, did you also anticipate, because you got hired as a bus driver but didn't have to drive a bus, when you got hired as a children's pastor, did you anticipate you wouldn't actually have to work with the children, or were you?
It's very astute of you. It was actually a really. I remember the first time I kind of had done an interview and was going to meet the church. And only a 16-hour-a-week job in a church plant on the university campus in Vancouver, and it was the most uncomfortable I've ever been. I was like, I just don't belong here with these like artsy, creative, intellectual types. Like I don't belong. Like I'm a small town Ontario kid. I don't fit here. So it was a very, very kind of a rapidly growing, expanding experience for me. And I had no real training, education, anything to do with kids. Like I really had no idea what I was doing.
Right.
I was just kind of like relying on my own intuition. And so I did expect to pastor kids, and I think, and I did my best. And those 3 years were really interesting because it kind of morphed from being really green, having really no experience, feeling like I was gonna like take all this knowledge that I had learned in college and channel it through these lectures. And that's where kind of the next kind of major cascading shift in my kind of professional life took place, is that I realized you can't really lecture to kids. You can't like
Right.
speak ideologically to them. You can't speak down to them. And so my shift became one of story. I started telling stories, crafting stories, immersive, playful experiences, that became kind of the bedrock of my ministry with that time. So by the time I started and by the time I ended 3 years later, I was doing vastly different things, far, far, far more comfortable in that position. And that kind of graduated me into the next kind of phase of my professional life. So I kind of finished up my master's, moved home, had our first kid, and I got a job at a church, in the same denomination that we were affiliated with for a while there. And it was another kind of, I have no idea what I'm doing. I kind of started as an advocate for children because I think kids for many, many, many years, centuries, have kind of gotten the short end of the stick. They get the least amount of actual attention in a church context. So it's like I started as a kind of an advocate for kids. I'm going to fight from the basement up, basically, through story and play. And what I didn't know, another major kind of accident through a series of things and circumstances at the church, I kind of grabbed on to a whole bunch more people within the congregation. My portfolio expanded. It basically tripled in size, and I was now working with youth and junior high and families. And though I wasn't in title an associate, it felt very much more like an associate role by the time I left Hanover Missionary. And most of my stuff, ironically, I actually didn't have a quote unquote pure children's ministry anymore. Like everything that I was doing with kids that involved kids was generational. It was no longer like just a scripted, specific kids ministry, quote unquote. Right. And so my whole arc has been kind of these series of happy accidents that have just kind of shaped my professional journey. And here I am again. I'm almost a year removed from that job, and I'm looking to pivot and launch a business in the winter that takes a lot of that kind of momentum and theory and belief and passion for kids and families and attachment and generations and storytelling in both ministry and non-ministry setting, kind of all wrapped up into one. And that's kind of where I hope to go.
That's cool. I just, near the end of that, I was thinking, so like my start was, I was in Bible college and we had this co-op fair, and somebody hired me to launch their children's ministry, their youth ministry. They were a pre-launch church plant. I'd been in Bible college for a total of 3 weeks, and the guy went, "Here, you can do it." And so it's funny, your story's kind of like, here, I was unqualified to do this thing, but and then you figure it out and then you kind of work. And I feel like a lot of the people I know in ministry are sort of just given that chance that maybe, somebody just sees something in you and goes, "Al, I don't know what it is about that person, but we're going to figure it out one way or another." So I would say, like, to anybody watching this, if you have somebody in your life that you're not sure whether they need a shot, or you maybe just give them that go, because you never know. Like, this is how we end up sitting here, right?
Absolutely. And I think both sides. Like I was absolutely my pastor at the time, Tim Horman. He's in Australia now. We're still friends. He absolutely took a chance on me, and but I also answered the call. Like so it takes both. Yeah, you have to answer.
Oh yeah.
To take a leap of courage.
Yeah. So that's so funny.
Yeah.
So I met you first. We were at a sort of like a planning, a youth ministry facilitation thing out west together. I was facilitating a conversation that you and a bunch of other leaders were a part of, and you stood out in the conversation because we would be talking high level, like youth ministry or ideas or programs or this. And then this is like one of my favorite things that's ever happened to me in ministry. You're sitting off in the corner. I know where you're sitting in the room. I can see it. You're off to the right. You're in the corners of the table. And then every once in a while, you just would go, can we just think about kids for a second here? Like, can we just consider for 1 minute how a kid is going to experience that? Or like, can we put ourselves in the shoes of children for a minute who always get the short end of the stick and think about ministry? And like, you did that a bunch. And that was kind of my sort of introduction to you of like, this guy thinks about children's ministry so much differently. Over your time from the beginning to now, what has sort of shaped that for you, right? Because it's just like any of us, when we start to beat the drum about something that we're really passionate about, it starts off little, but then it gets big. And I know that I got into your life when it was big. But kind of how did that work? And then what are the things that you're seeing?
Yeah, actually, back to that first kind of phase of early exposure to in and out of school care setting was really where I think the shift started to happen, or I guess the paradigm. I wasn't sheltered as a kid growing up, but I wasn't not sheltered, if that makes sense. I had safe harbor with my family. I was well connected to my church, but I hadn't experienced the full gamut of life. So to be in a kind of an inner city, low income, low economic, socioeconomic strata, working with kids and families that are mostly from difficult situations, it was just eye-opening, and it was the first kind of time that I was able to interact, not only just see on the outside, but actually interact and have a relationship with kids who are
Right.
hurting. And the fact that you kind of recognize that they're kind of passive. They're on the bus of life, but they didn't buy the ticket. Like they didn't choose to be
Mm,
on this bus. They're just on it. They're riding it. Someone else is driving it for them. How can you kind of hold them responsible for things that they really don't have much control over? And so that was
mhm.
the first kind of um, exposure to the situation of childhood, not just children, but like what does it mean to be a child? Like, and how does a child experience life? What is childhood really about? And
Right.
so when I kind of took that kind of passion or sense of advocacy into my first ministry job, uh, like I was in a part of a really great church, a church that prioritized children enough to hire me and to make that a priority for their congregation. But in terms of the congregational life, our children had very little natural rhythm with congregational life. Like
Right.
children weren't considered as equals around the table, and that was certainly the case
Mm,
to my first full-time job at my previous church. Like kids were not a part of the ebbs and flows of daily or even weekly corporate worship. They had their own thing. You could do your own thing. Um, and it really wasn't until year 2 or 3 into that I started to realize that you can do whatever you want in your children's ministry, but if you don't have the cooperation of parents and you don't have the buy-in of the congregation, and there's not this overlapping and interweaving, your ministry is really hampered. It's really hindered. And so that was kind of as that trajectory started to kind of roll along, I started to do more and more intentional things around weaving kids into congregational service. I realized actually there's some really deep held, really embedded systemic things within mainstream. I'll speak for even evangelicals. I don't know, any other tradition, but I grew up in the evangelical church, so I'll speak kind of broad brush strokes here. So forgive me, anybody. But children are just not a part of they're not a priority within our main kind of corporate worship events or our main corporate
Now,
worship.
do you think that's like I'm not sure you would say that. you don't necessarily think that's malicious. It's like, it's not like we're holding them down. It's more just, they're at the smaller table, or they're not at the table where conversations are had. So things aren't brought up. And it's not that people aren't thinking about kids, but maybe people aren't thinking like kids. Like, is that kind of right? Because we're not trying to look at anybody and go, you didn't do this, because like we've all been part of churches where kids have been important but not a priority, and I think maybe those things are different.
Absolutely, and I think it's touchy, and I've gotten myself in a lot of trouble over the years because and it gets people's backs up, and it
Right.
comes across a certain way. I guess it's sometimes it's like do you use like a sword or a quill? I don't know. Like, do you like how do you go about advocating for
Right.
a marginalized people group that can't
Right.
advocate for themselves, that have never been able to advocate for themselves, that have no ability or capacity to advocate for themselves, and we think we're advocating for them, and we're actually not.
Right.
I think it's tough. So sometimes I get kind of cage rattling because um, I don't mean to do that. I don't mean to do that maliciously either. No,
No,
I
I didn't think you were. No.
I think the distinction is that children and childhood, I think, is how I'm beginning to frame it. Is
Right.
children are, snotty nose, running, loud, eccentric. They interrupt. I've got 3 kids, like they're constantly making messes. There's nothing about
Right.
children that's efficient or clean or seamless, but childhood is incredibly precious.
Right.
Childhood needs to be safeguarded. It needs to be housed. Like, childhood is the place where children learn to take risks, learn to develop, learn to see things, learn to kind of problem solve, learn to be self-agents, learn to have perseverance, like learn to imagine and create and wonder and have curiosity. And it's like, so childhood is, I don't see a lot of childhood in our mainline or evangelical churches. I see a lot of
Mm.
adulthood. I see a lot of
Right.
form, doctrine, creeds, belief structures, in and out statements, and we wrestle with the minutia of all these things. And if we just injected a little bit more childhood, I think we would find that it would open up a lot more doors. It would be a lot more freeing, I think. And so,
Right.
but the hard thing is children and childhood come together, and children are really inefficient, and they're really loud, and they don't work in the adult world.
Right.
So, like, by way of example, I remember at my previous church, I was, run the children's ministry. So it literally is in the basement. Run, do your thing. You've got classrooms. The classrooms were basically prison cells. They were cinder walls with a tiny porthole window and door, with no light, like no natural light. They were
Right.
prison cells. They were awful to be in. They're extremely loud. It just did not work. So I brought the kids out into the big space because I loved mixed ages, and I mixed all the ages up, and I broke down the classrooms and such. All the poles that were kind of holding up the basement, the floor above the sanctuary, had these like sharp trim work around the form of the pole. And I asked one of the senior older pastors, like, what's that for? He's like, well, if it's not there, the chairs will bump up and knock the chip the paint off the pole. So we have this thing here to keep the chairs from nudging and chipping the paint. And was like, well, that's actually eye level for a kid. So
Right.
like, they're going to the hospital because they've cracked open their skull. So like, our space, our physical space,
Yeah.
wasn't even child friendly because the adult chairs were actually the priority. And this is like 8 years ago. This is not like 50 years ago. This is,
of course.
it's like, so that kind of work to like, how do you prioritize childhood? How do you give space for imagination, creativity, and messiness, playfulness, inefficiency, as opposed to kind of what I think implicitly adults, we lose our childhood because life gets hard and life gets tough, and Like, it's filled with challenges, and we feel boxed in, or we feel threatened, or we feel insecure. Like, I get it. Like, I'm there. I'm an adult. How do we how do we give space for childhood? So as my ministry continued to evolve, I basically shifted. Kind of the major shift was I stopped treating kids specially. I started treating everybody like kids. I started
Right.
trying to
Oh, interesting.
tease out the childhood in everybody.
That's so interesting, because in so many ministries, sorry to interrupt, and I'm going to just make you dig into that, because that's so smart. So often I've been in youth ministry and been like, you know what, I'm going to treat you like grown-ups. Like, I'm not going to treat you like kids, because to me that's, in those moments I was like equalizing. I'm like, I don't want to treat you, but you're saying the other way. Like, can we actually, can you dig into that a bit? Because that's one of the coolest things anybody's ever said to me. That's really smart.
It's actually Jesus. So here again, here's my I hang my hat, my whole philosophy, my whole professional career on this idea, this like, as a follower of Jesus, as a believer who adores the scriptures, and I immerse my life in the scriptures. It's like, and I'm surrounded by a community of people who've done the same. How then have we forgotten or overlooked this quintessential saying of Jesus, that unless you become like a child, you will not enter the kingdom of God? Like, it's not like just a whimsy thing of like, oh yeah, maybe kids are kind of cool. Like, Jesus, he says verbatim, unless you become like a child, you will not enter the kingdom of God. So then adults interpret this, well, every commentary I've ever read, every preach I've ever heard about it, it's, well, then you have faith like a child, and be simple like a child.
There's a Jars of Clay song like that or something. Yeah.
Perhaps Jesus have meant more. So like, some of these two ideas of like childhood psychology and my emerging view of childhood, and not children, but childhood with imagination and wonder and play and story and co-creation and all these things, and then the gospel. It's like, just made sense to me that Jesus is actually inviting us to all those other things, those qualities, the meekness, the humility, like to be the less than. Like, in Jesus' day, kids were nothing, right? So unless you become nothing, you can't enter the kingdom of God. There's all those layers of what I think Jesus is meaning. Yes.
Right.
But I think he may be actually saying something else, that to participate in the kingdom of God, you actually have to have imagination. You actually have to have enough curiosity and wonder and imagination to co-create with somebody else in this invisible world that you can't see, i.e. the kingdom of God. So kids do this seamlessly. They're in and out of these imaginary worlds constantly, without any effort at all. And if you watch a bunch of kids play, you could find a bunch of kids at a playground, and they may not know each other, may not know their ages, they don't know where they've come from, they don't know their religious backgrounds, they don't know their names. They jump into play and they start immediately constructing a world together where there's seamlessness between the laws that govern that world, the magic that presides over that world, the characters, and then they start embodying personality and traits and adventure and risk assessments and all these beautiful things that play does in this imaginary world. And it's like, well, mechanically, is Jesus not asking us is that not the kingdom? That here we are, brothers in Christ, though we have no blood relation, we don't really know each other, we have no reason to actually care for each other outside of this imaginary invisible kingdom that we've been invited to be a part of. And that takes imagination, it takes co-creation, it takes co-cooperation, it takes, I believe, childhood. So rather than say, I'm going to treat everyone like adults, I'm saying, I'm going to treat everyone like kids.
That's so awesome.
I'm going to tell stories. I'm going to give opportunities to play. I'm going to prioritize co-creation. I'm going to actually involve children in the corporate worship, and not prioritizing children. That's one of those main distinctions that I've fought all these years. Is like, it's not Chuck E. Cheese. Like, I'm not giving, family fun time with balls and bouncy stuff. No, it's actually just treating children with respect in their childhood, and actually teasing out and inviting the childhood in all of us to kind of tap into that child, the child in all of us.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's awesome. So how have you how have you done this practically? Like, so first of all, I want you, you've used the term co-create a lot. So I just want you to quickly define that. And then, you know, just in your ministry time, how have you made that adjustment? How have you been doing that practically?
So co-creation is, yeah, absolutely. It's a really, it's a great word. So I'll go back to a book I read on Tolkien. So Lord of the Rings, you're familiar with Lord of the Rings? It's a very popular
Sure.
book.
Yeah. Yes. I
Take
watched the
any,
movies.
yeah, it's okay. Well, the books are good. And what
Right.
Tolkien did, so this commentator who's talking about Tolkien, is what Tolkien does is he creates a world through his written word that actually it invites you as a reader to co-create with him. That this is basically the work of fiction and all storytelling, is that it's not, as opposed to like an image or a movie where it's kind of imposed upon you, these visuals and stimulus are imposed upon you. You kind of can't work, your brain can't work with that, right? You think, I immediately think of like Michael Bay's Transformers, right? The overwhelming grandiosity of his Transformer movies where like buildings are collapsing and there's a bazillion pieces of glass falling. It is so visually overwhelming. All your brain can do is take it in. There's
Right.
no back. You're not imagining anything. He leaves nothing to the imagination.
Right.
Literature, good story, good fiction, i.e. Tolkien. Um, this one commentator saying is basically you become a sub-creator, that the work actually requires you to paint the grass and the fields and to paint the tapestry of the background and to hear the voices of the characters. And good fiction does that. So you actually become a participant in Tolkien's work, which is, I think, why there's such resonance, like why there's a cult following, why there's, you know, a million people go to Comic-Con dressed up as Gandalf, because they actually feel like Gandalf. Same could be said for Star Wars, for Star Trek, these kind of, they're Harry Potter, these worlds that are created that as a participant of, in your own imagination, you are sub-creating alongside the author in the creation of their world. And so it creates this world. The world is consistent, it's believable. It holds, the magic of the world holds, the characters hold, it all makes sense. You're not reading Lord of the Rings and questioning if hobbits actually exist and if they're, how tall are they, and well, that's preposterous. It just makes sense, right?
Right.
Because your imagination is kind of doing half the work along with the author. So I think when I think of sub-creation, I think, well, in the sense of literature and story, but also in the sense of play, that kids become co-creators of these worlds. When my kids play together, they're just doing it a couple hours ago, where my eldest daughter will be a horse, my son will sit on her back. They have rules that govern their little horsey world, and they've created this world together that they're existing in, and it's seamless. And they're not fighting over, you know, what color of the mountains are, or, you know, what ground the ground looks like and how many stones are in their imagination. No, they're just working cooperatively together. They become co-creators of a new thing. So when we come to the scriptures as people of God, as storyers, a part of the story of Jesus and the ongoing story of God in the world, we are sub-creators with that ongoing narrative, that we've been invited into another narrative. We've been invited into participating with the story of Jesus, that the Gospels don't come to us as like bam, 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 doctrine, dogma, policy, whatever, as church often is. They've come to us in narrative, messy, sometimes disjointed, sometimes hard to read, and beautifully inspired. There's nothing wrong with that. Doesn't make it not God inspired or God breathed. That, I think, is the breath of God, is his active invitation to be a part of it and to be sub-creators with him in this ongoing story, which is why I think the Christian church has resonance today as much as it did 2,000 years ago, that this story isn't dead. It's constantly ever growing because more and more people are involved in it. So this triangulation between, you know, the spirit of Jesus in a community, the scriptures, and then the community itself, there's a beautiful co-creation that happens. Every local church, every local gathering, every kind of conversation is something brand new, because we're kind of all participating in something beyond just ourselves. We're co-creating together.
Right.
If that makes any sense.
And Yeah, and we've discussed, and I think this will lead into where you're kind of headed. What we've discussed has how, as you grow up, as you become an adult, your imagination shrinks, and your create, like that natural ability for you to create and fill in the blanks. You're looking for more of the Transformers model. The don't give me a lot that I need to figure out, just give it all to me, as opposed to sort of living in and co-creating alongside those biblical narratives. But then we teach kids that way. We don't sometimes leave the space to explore the what it looks like or what it felt like or what this could have been or that could have been. And is that kind of the disconnect in this teaching, in the storytelling, from the way adults are learning and teaching to the way that kids just not even aren't learning, just where they're at?
Well, I actually think it's maybe a little bit more simple, because I don't think, and when I made this kind of the shift to my own ministry practice to treat everyone like children, it wasn't because I'm arrogant and haughty and think, well, I'm gonna force this down on adults. It's because actually the feedback was, I was hearing a lot of childhood out of adults, that we all have stories. If we're followers of Jesus, we have met or encountered Jesus. It's a story. It's like an experience. It's like an impression. It's a part of our life. We're not a sum of facts and kind of blobulous molecules floating through space. We have our own narrative. We have our own purpose. We have our own intention, our own beginning, our own end, our own futures. We're storying creatures, and we just kind of forgotten that. So the core of the gospel is good news. God's loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son. Like it's a narrative. It's a story. We find ourselves in the story. I think the disconnect actually happens when the values of the gathering kind of co-opt that thing. And I think in the last 100 years or so, I don't know, I'm not a church historian, but certainly in the last 200 years, the evangelical church, I could speak for more generally, we started prioritizing different things. So efficiency, size, we value expedited messaging, we value broadband messaging, we value almost passive consumerism, in terms of we could sit down 1,000 people in one auditorium to listen to one person. But that's not a community building event. That's not a storying event. That's not a participating event. It's a passive event. It's a passive sort of thing. So our models have actually kind of drifted away from local churches who, the scriptures would have been the center of their thing, but their gathering would have been very much a storying gathering where you're sharing in each other's lives, you're investing in each other's lives. And I think there's a tension in a lot of mainline churches that that's what they want. We're still kind of bound up in a different set of values have kind of co-opted our worship practices. And unfortunately, going full circle, children don't have a part of that, right? So children don't have a part of that, and neither does childhood. It's too inefficient. You don't have any certainty. It's too messy. The outcomes aren't guaranteed. But if you don't care about your outcomes, if you kind of release that, if you don't care about efficiency, you kind of release that. You don't care about expedited messaging, you kind of release that. I think you'd find a lot more freedom. You'd also find a lot more mess and uncertainty and insecurity. But I think you'd also find a lot more life and joy and imagination and wonder and more of that childhood stuff. So
that's cool.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. So how can the average church start to make this shift? So I mean, churches, especially bigger ones that in Canada's context, when I say bigger, I mean like over 200 or 250, right? That have that sort of we gather once a week model. Like, it's not that things in the middle of the week don't happen, but like you said, that central gathering is a big deal. How do you take some of that that thought, that learning, that sort of diverting what we've always done to getting more creative and getting more a part of the story? How do you integrate that in a way that's like functional and that's graspable? Like, every church is going to be able to do it a little bit differently. One pastor might say, we're going to go full Amos. And then the other part might go, well, we're going to go halfway in, but what does halfway in look like while we kind of figure that out? So like, how can a church start to think about that differently? What types of things do they need to be considering that they're not thinking about when they're thinking about this sort of thing?
I think as a pastor, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the pastor, because I think the cross section between the pastor is the leadership who makes the call basically in the congregation.
Sure, or whatever the church structure happens to be, whoever the decision makers are. Yeah,
I think it is a really it's a great distinction that needs to be made, because I think that's actually part of the systemic problem is that I learned. I was taught. I didn't learn it. I didn't seek it. It kind of just happened. Another happy accident. I kind of followed my gut and dismantled some of my ministries and started a new ministry in my final year, right before COVID hit. So 2019 and 2020. And it was a shift in a model, but the model taught me back. And it basically taught me that, Amos, as a pastor, you really don't have that big of a job to do. Like, the pastoring or the shepherding, the shepherd isn't the savior to every sheep, right? The shepherd steers and clears and advocates and guards. The sheep are sheep within themselves, right? Like the sheep self-herd, the sheep self-teach, the sheep lead other sheep to grass. Like the shepherd isn't doing absolutely everything for every individual sheep.
Right.
So if you facilitate it in a way to actually release some of that control, and that's really tough for pastors. As a pastor, it's really hard to do. To say that I'm not actually that important, and not that I need to work myself out of a job, because I think the role of the pastor is really important. But what am I actually trying to do? I'm actually trying to facilitate people to self-pastor, to take community seriously. So I'm going to lay aside some efficiency things. I'm going to lay aside some. I think that's the first thing you have to do. If you wanted to make a shift like this, you have to accept that outcomes and guarantees and your metrics are going to change. Your growth metrics are going to be different. You're going to be looking for different outcomes. You're not going to have the control that you have. You're not going to have the efficiency that you're going to have. And you kind of allow the congregation to kind of take matters into their own hands, to take the story into their own hands, take their community into their own, trust them. Trust the kids around the table, trust the youth around the table. So I did that. What I'm referencing is it was through a meal. We kind of dismantled our midweek ministry stuff, and we all just came together and ate together and served each other. And what it taught me was, in that model where I'm not the thing, I'm not the show, everybody participated into making it happen.
Right.
No one could be passive in a large family gathering meal. No one. You had to resist community formation. You couldn't just sit passively and tune out and check out and scroll your phone while I'm preaching. Like you actually have to engage with the person beside you, or actively be rude and resist, which happened, and people didn't come back because it was too much. The ask was too great to actually befriend and show hospitality to the person that they don't really know. Ironically, they've sat beside in a pew for 10 years, but they actually don't know.
Right.
That meal format actually led way to kind of a time of service where people were kind of voluntarily giving their gifts and teaching these mixed ages and generations basically to do all kinds of stuff. We had a sewing group and a woodworking group and a writers club and a volleyball camp, and then we all came back for a bedtime story. That was just a story. And again, generationally, it was a story with a very, very light application. And then everybody went home. Yeah. I grew up in the church my whole life. It was one of the first experiences like, this is church. Like every week felt like a family reunion is how it felt. A good,
that's so cool,
wonderful, life-giving family reunion where everybody has not only a seat at the table, but everybody's participating into making it happen. So there's all kinds of things you can do. You asked me this a while back, and I've been thinking about it ever since. Like, what could it do? It's like, well, there's two really simple things. One is a question: do you believe? The first, I just ask that pastor to say to you, like, Mike, do you believe that the Sunday worship gathering is a priority in the spiritual formation of your congregants?
Right. Yeah. Are you asking me that question?
I'm asking you now.
Yeah. Boy. So now you're going to turn this around and you're going to get me in trouble. I think that knowing the goal or the point of the Sunday morning gathering is a really big priority. If that's not too much of a cop out, right? I think knowing what you're trying to accomplish during that time is more important than just the time on its own,
Sure.
right? So I've worked with churches that get together each and every week on a Sunday, and they don't really know why, other than they just know what they're doing, that they're doing it. And so I would sit there and go, this time, here's a time where everybody is already conditioned to get together. So that's really important because that's already built in. So how can we take that and make it?
Do you think that's important?
Sorry, go ahead. Do I think that it's important that everybody gathers together?
Yeah.
As a church?
Yeah.
Every once in a while? Yeah, I think that's important. Yeah.
Okay, so here's get some
but what it looks like, it can look like 1,000 different things. I think gathering together is the important part, but then knowing why you're gathering together is important. But this is my interview, not your interview. So
no.
So
well, there's an ecclesial thing going on here. So if gathering is important,
right.
At all, and then not because I think some of the hang up is, well, how we gather now isn't important. Like the rock concert isn't important or whatever, and we've kind of dismissed, but the actual physical gathering of followers of Jesus, is that important in the life and the spiritual formation of a follower of Jesus?
Sure, I think absolutely it is. Yeah.
Probably, like it's probably up there in terms of one of the.
I would think so. Yeah.
Edification and encouragement and all the rest, all those good pastoral words, right?
Sure.
Is everybody included in that? Like would you count everybody? Like it's important for everybody, young and old, to gather together.
I mean, I was in family ministry for too long, so I'm maybe a little bit biased, but I would say yes. I think it's important that everybody gathers together. But again, I think sometimes we kid ourselves and we say everybody gathers together, but then half the people leave. So we're not really all gathered together in a lot of cases. We're all in the same building, but we're not necessarily together.
Not together, yeah. So like that, I would, if you were the pastor, these are the questions I'd be asking. Like, do you think it's important to gather? Is everybody included in that? So
those are tough questions, by the way. Those are good. And I wasn't even, I'm only ready for them because I know you're going to throw something like that at me every once in a while. And we've talked about this stuff before, but those are tough questions to answer.
Yeah. Because the answer for a lot, like in my experience, was I was a children's pastor for almost 10 years. And one out of 5 weeks, finally, I guess in the end, we were all together. But 4 to 5 weeks, you come in the door, basically, I think of it as like mom and calf is separated and calves are shuffled downstairs. Like, so this consequential time that in the life of the church is held sacred for 2,000 years as this gathering together is this preeminent value of kind of all of our church metrics and all of our church statistics and all of our measurements of growth and stability, why we have doors open, and we have all these kind of counter movements to do with home church and whatever else. But the gathering is really central, except not everyone is considered equal in that.
Right. No, yeah, so, that's true.
So if your answer is yes to both, would you consider doing 2 things?
Yeah.
Bringing everybody together physically.
Right.
And just telling a story. Opening up the Gospels, find your favorite story in the Bible. Just tell a story. Don't preach. Just tell a story. Don't sermonize. Just tell a story. Get into that narrative and just tell a story and see how the feedback, the biofeedback of the room, the group, our kids and youth and elderly and young and old and moms and dads, are they tracking? And if they are, you're co-creating. Like what has just happened as a storyteller, I think, John refers to this. He's like, the word becomes flesh. I'm not saying we're Jesus, but it's like the sharing of our testimony The sharing of our story is the transmission of the gospel. Like, that's it. It's through our testimony. Go and teach and preach in this way of life, baptize in the threefold name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Go and share and testify to what Christ has done in your life. Go and story with other people. So as a preacher, as a shepherd of a congregation, my job is to, I think, tell story, is to invite co-creation and then give space for that thing to work itself out. Those two things, gather together, just tell a story. Very simple and practical, really, really hard to do. And I mean, there's a million reasons why it wouldn't work. And well, it interrupts our flow of service. And where do we put the worship? And what happens when the kids get squirrely? And well, we're not set up physically for that. We've got pews or benches or chairs, or we're an auditorium, or how do you have that many kids? There's a million reasons not to do it. But then those reasons are actually indicators of the systemic things that have held us back from involving and being kind of to prioritizing childhood and in the mix.
Right. That's right. It's the answer to the question. If you think this is that important, why are you letting anything stand in the way? Sort of.
You shouldn't.
Sort of thing, yeah.
And so if I was to get really preachy on my soapbox, it's the results. So I guess the application is like, it isn't a cognitive thing. It isn't a thing that you just one of those values that we have is that expedited messaging and that kind of almost downloadable content that, well, now you're a believer because you can profess, right? Or you know your scriptures, you can recite that, whatever. So it's all a very heavy, heady, cognitive thing. When actually I think I'm learning more and more and feeling compelled more and more that the actual work of the Spirit within the community is through that intergenerational gathering, because that's necessary for everybody to actually develop and form as human beings. So those attachment bonds between the old and the young are absolutely essential for our kids and our youth to not only graft into a life of faith, but actually just to develop as human beings, that they actually feel attached and secure, that they can actually take risks, that they can actually invent, they can actually not feel insecure, they can actually stand up to peer pressure, they can actually make sound decisions because they're not perpetually living in a peer-centric, peer-oriented culture that makes them dreadfully insecure and anxious. So the sociological imprint of a family gathering or a generational gathering is actually, it's paramount for our kids and our youth to grow and develop as healthy, mature adults. And then the gift is that actually that teases out the childhood in the adults. So you tell me why grandparents love their grandkids. It's because they're remembering their own childhood. They're being reinvited back into that kind of that place of wonder and play.
Right.
That is human. So I think if we made some shifts in our values, we would have, I think, very different outcomes.
That's already a ton to digest. And you've just said a lot there that I think a lot of people should probably think long and hard about and sort of look introspectively. We're not going to get to all the places that I wanted to get to today. I'm going to have to invite you back. We're going to have to do this. No, don't apologize. It was really good. But you are sort of transitioning into becoming a sort of professional storyteller. So, right. Yeah. Hey,
that would be wonderful, actually.
That's what you do, right? So, so in the few minutes here that we have left, we kind of teased out that first one, right? Asking the questions, what do you think is important? That second one is story. So what makes a good story? How does somebody build a good story in a way that isn't preachy, teachy, but just leaves room? And then if you want to transition to maybe how you're doing that today with Chasing.Lion and what you're up to, that would be really cool.
I guess real quick, because it's really hard in my early, I still do this. It's really hard to not do is, if your story has a point, it's not a story.
Oh,
that's what I would say.
That's a really big statement. That's a huge statement. If your story has a point, I'm just adjusting my headphones, making sure I heard that right. If your story has a point, it's not really a story.
That's what I say to myself. So I'm not
That's
saying
awesome.
that across the board. I'm not saying it, whatever,
No,
whatever.
it's
There's
just you and me here. Nobody's going to watch this.
Yeah. For me, I was in my master's. I came full face front with my disposition as a creative. I don't want to call myself an artist, but it was an art kind of seminar, and I struggled not to have message laden art. And the challenge back to me was, if your art is message laden, it's no longer art. If you have a point to it and you're driving home a point, you're not inviting something, you're not inviting participation back.
Right.
So that's the risk of a story, is that you don't actually know the outcome. So like, and I in the evangelical world, I have had these conversations before. Wow. Right, but in the actual gospels themselves, there's evidence of this rolling out as I think Mark and Matthew, I don't remember, Matthew or Luke, I can't remember which one, where the high priest is actually nullifying the life of Jesus in the narrative. He's saying lots of people are going to say this and that, but just let this story play out, and he's going to fade it. Jesus is going to fade out like all the other revolutionaries. Like this freedom in the narrative is actually given by the gospels themselves, because people in the story of Jesus actually didn't believe Jesus when they saw him. Because the risk of the story is that if it has a deep purpose and it's pointed and is driving home to a particular message, the more you do that, the less art is embedded in that thing. So I try really hard to I think the flip side is a story without a climax isn't a story. So a story without like a peak or, a resolve, or there's all different kinds of ways you can tell a story. But so in terms of preaching, I was thinking kind of as a pastor, I've gathered everybody, but now I'm going to tell a story. What does it look like? Don't have a point. Don't come with, well, this is what this is saying, because then it's a preach. There's nothing wrong with preaching. Right. We need preaching. Yeah. We need lectures. We need information. We need data. We need passionate speeches. But that's not necessarily a story. A story is invitational. I've probably gotten in a lot of trouble. Hopefully nobody watches this.
No, this is amazing. So how do you tell a good story? Because now 5 minutes ago, I thought I knew how to tell a story. And, we did an Instagram live a while ago where you went through the cards in your story in a box, and I thought I knew how to tell a story. And now I'm pretty sure I don't know how. So,
no. We're all.
I don't mean that as a bad way. No. I mean, so how do you tell a good story? Like, how does that, how do you leave it open?
Have I ever told a good story? I don't know. I don't know.
Am I asking the wrong question? Am I, instead of saying how do you tell a good story, should I just say how do I tell a story? Because it's the people that interact with it that make it good. Is that part of the deal?
I'm focusing on I'm good, bad. There's good and bad stories all over the place.
Yeah, it's art. It's subjective, right?
It's that the mechanics of it. Like if you're using, which I think a lot of the classically in Sunday school, David and Goliath. It's like David goes to the river and he picks up the 5 stones, the stone of truth and the stone of righteousness. It's like the story has been co-opted by ideology. Well, we want you to be truthful. We want you to have courage. We want you to believe. And so we're going to take those elements of the story and co-opt it and neuter the story itself. The story of David and Goliath needs no interjection, right? It needs no co-option or co-opting of ideology. It's really
it's all there.
It's all there. This tiny little guy has no business fighting this giant of a man. The giant of the man is mocking God. The tiny little guy is defending God, the God of the universe. It's an impossible story. It resonates because it's such a great story. You don't need to then go in there and muddle it up to make sure everybody knows what the real point of the story is.
Right.
And when you do that, the more you co-opt, the more you interfere, or the more you try to make the message heavy, the less of the story comes through, less of the art comes through. So Goliath isn't as big and grueling. You're not spending your time imagining his ugly face. and his big
Right.
bulging muscles, and you're not imagining tiny little David and his weakly little arms, like, and the contrast and the tension, and you're not really feeling the anxiety that David should feel but doesn't, and the courage that he has. It's like
Right.
you're being co-opted by these other ideas, these other, truth statements or whatever.
Right.
So that's, I guess, what I'm trying to say.
Because going back to what you said, if you have a Sunday school teacher or whomever that says, okay, what were the 5 stones, the stone of righteousness, the stone of truth, then that's the thing you're trying to remember, and you're not actually focusing on the thing that's right in front of you that is so wonderful.
And a lot of kids' curriculums do exactly that. They take these beautiful stories, and then they just, I had this idea a long time ago of, like, if you're like a vineyard, and do you want kids to have the capsule of the grape taste, or do you want them to, like, feel the grapes in their hands? Like, if the stories are the grapes, do you want them to wander through the vineyard and pick the grapes and feel the grapes and squish the grapes and have the whole experience of making the juice or the wine? Or are you just going to give them a tiny little cup at the end? Because that's basically what we've done. Is you say, well, we've taken all the juice, we've squished it all for you, we've pruned it all for you, we've done all this work for you, and this is actually what's so important for you, is this tiny little juice. Take it back and have a little sip. No, that's not formation. Like, so the story is the wandering through the vineyard, but some kids aren't going to do that very efficiently. So, like, some kids are going to wander and play and not care about the grapes at all. Like, it's so what we come back to values. What is it more important to us to make sure everybody takes this swig back, or do we actually want to catch them in the beauty of the formation of the moment of the story?
That's so impactful, because you think about, we think about faith formation in teens and young adults, and we look at the stats of how many people walk away from the church at such an age. And I think, because it's really easy for somebody to continue the analogy at my own peril, to come along and say, well, that juice doesn't taste good.
Yeah.
And now you didn't experience, right? If somebody can explain how it got from the vine to the cup, then it's a lot easier to tell that person why they like the juice than it is, well, somebody told me to like the juice.
Yeah. Well, and if you go all ways, well, I didn't know that it actually grew that way. I didn't know that there's roots in the ground, and how do you make the soil strong? What about the sun conditions, and what kind of weather do you need to grow grapes? Like, it can go in a million different ways. But all you ever give is just the capsulized. Then what? Like, we're missing out on so much.
So huge. That's so huge. That's enormous. Okay, we are going to continue this conversation, because I think what you just said and a couple things before is going to have a lot of people thinking. It's got me thinking, and I thought I knew what I was coming into, and I don't. So that's always fun. I love it when I have a conversation like, I think I know where this is going to go. Nope. I should have learned that with our conversations by now. So please tell people what you're up to. Can you promote yourself for a half second? Tell people what you're doing. Tell people what Chasing.Lion is. Because now what people should want to do after all this is reach out to you and say, hey, do you develop curriculum that we can use? Or do you have a book? Or do you have whatever? Like, this is, how can you help people that are listening to this take that next step forward? Because you do it all the time, and I think you're really good at it.
I've been slouching this whole time. I hurt my shoulder surfing.
That's the weight of you changing how everybody does children's ministry right now. That's what you're feeling.
Stop.
No. Go ahead.
Chasing.Lion is a pursuit of meaning. So it is an art collective. I have lots of different projects. It's kind of an umbrella, soon to be a corporation, hopefully, business, an umbrella business that has lots of different irons in the fire. Lots of different projects that are basically all aimed at this general idea of childhood and story and kind of attachment and family and generational family. When I say family, I don't mean nuclear family. I mean family connectedness, relationships. Should have said that right from the beginning. But and yes, I am developing curriculum that is narrative based. Surprise. And I had a beta testing in the fall with a few churches, and I hope to have a soft beta launch in February.
Cool.
And so hopefully by June of 2021, I will have a full marketable mapping out a story of Mark over 35 weeks in 7 different chapters of these kind of very adaptive narratives that can be adapted for pastors, congregations, children's ministries, families, at-home Bible studies, to kind of put the story in your hands and let you make it fit in your context. So I think it's kind of it's a very different approach to a lot of curriculums that I've kind of worked with and come across over the years that are very scripted, very, very laid out, very kind of plug and play, very digital heavy. This is very much an adaptive sort of attempt to help inspire you, say if you're the pastor, you and your team, to see story as the mechanism for formation in community.
That's cool.
So I've got a couple
awesome.
that hopefully in the spring I'll out to launch as well. So
right.
Yeah, I am.
That's awesome. Well, where do people find you?
Instagram, I believe, is Chasing.Lion, and Facebook is Chasing.Lion.studio. I think you could find it out there.
Yeah.
On the
well,
website.
we'll make sure we'll link to everything in the description of the episode here. Yeah. Any last words? Any last tidbits of wisdom? Something you felt like you should have said but you hadn't yet?
I'm sorry if I offended anybody.
No, she didn't. This is amazing. This is so great. Okay, we're gonna have you back. I'm so grateful for you being here, and you have opened me up to thinking about things that I haven't thought about before today, and so I always appreciate when you do that, because every time I talk to you, you do that, and I'm glad that happened today. So,
well, I appreciate the time, the conversation. You're doing great work.
Well, that's good.
Lots of love.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll talk to you later.
Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. Make sure that you like and subscribe and share this episode with anybody that you think should hear it. We'd love to have a comment and see what you're thinking, so put those down below, and we can't wait to see you next week. Big thanks to Amos. If you want to see any of the things that he's doing, all of the links are in the description today too. Make sure you get on his stuff, give him some encouragement, and let him know how he's helped you shape the next story that you're going to tell. We'll talk to you really soon.